The air in the Burmese jungle is not empty. It is a physical weight. It presses down with the oppressive humidity of a greenhouse, thick with the competing scents of rain-soaked earth. The sharp tang of high-octane fuel and the sweet, cloying decay of a world that never stops growing and dying. A constant high-pitched drone of cicadas stitches the silence between the roar of engines, a relentless soundtrack to a forgotten war. In the mornings, a heavy mist cloaks the airfield, clinging to the wings of the waiting fighters, making the cold metal sweat as if in fear. By midday, the sun is a merciless white disk in a bleached sky, turning the tarmac into a shimmering mirror and the inside of the hangars into blast furnaces where the very air seems to warp and tremble. This is a place where victory is measured not in miles, but in feet and seconds. Here at the frayed edge of the world, the symbols of an empire fight against the encroaching green. The stark red circle of the Hinomaru stands out against the fuselage of a Mitsubishi A6M0, its paint faded and chipped by salt and combat. This aircraft is more than a machine. It is an article of faith, a testament to the belief that Japanese spirit and agility can overcome any material advantage. Yet a subtle weariness has settled over the base. The initial confidence has been eroded by attrition, replaced by a grim mechanical reality. The formal commands of the officers slice through the humid air, but they carry a new tension, a quiet desperation that hangs unspoken beneath the veneer of military discipline. Why does this remote outpost feel like the final line of defense for an entire way of life? One man watches the dawn break, not with the eyes of a soldier, but with the focused gaze of an engineer. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, a veteran ace, sees the world in lines of force and principles of aerodynamics. His calm demeanor is a mask for a razor-sharp mind that is constantly dissecting the reality around him. He observes the ground crew not for their morale, but for the efficiency of their movements, the precision of their repairs. He is a man of dualities, a patriot devoted to the emperor and the ancient code of Bushido, but also a pragmatist who worships at the altar of physics. His ambition is not for personal glory, but for a cold mechanical perfection that will keep his men alive. He feels a paternal responsibility for the young pilots who look to him, a weight heavier than any G-force. The myth of the Zero is whispered in the barracks and proclaimed in the briefing rooms. It is a scalpel against the enemy's sledgehammer, a dancer in the sky whose grace is unmatched. It is the physical embodiment of the pilot soul. Any report of its failings is dismissed as an anomaly, the fault of an inexperienced pilot, or a simple stroke of bad luck. The High Command in Tokyo issues directives based on this sacred belief, and to question it is to question the very spirit of Japan. But Kenji has read the combat reports from the front, the chillingly similar accounts of pilots being bounced from above, struck by an enemy they never saw coming. A pattern is emerging, a ghost in the data that the official narrative refuses to acknowledge. The truth he suspects is being paid for in blood. Then, one sweltering afternoon, it arrives, a foreign shape beneath a heavy tarpaulin, delivered like a caged beast. When the canvas is pulled away, it reveals not the familiar angular lines of their own machines, but a creature of elegant, menacing curves. A captured Supermarine Spitfire MKV, almost perfectly intact. It is a war prize, an object of intense curiosity and arrogant dismissal among the other pilots. They see a clumsy, heavy machine, no match for the nimble Zero. But as Kenji approaches it, he sees something else. He sees an elliptical wing designed for performance, at altitudes they can barely reach. He sees a powerful, liquid-cooled engine that speaks a different language of power. It sits on their tarmac not as a trophy, but as a silent, profound challenge to everything they believe. Kenji runs a hand over the smooth, riveted skin of the Spitfire's fuselage. It is cool to the touch despite the oppressive heat. The polished canopy reflects the tropical sky, but it feels like it holds a different heaven within it, a different set of rules. His orders are simple: evaluate its weaknesses, dissect its flaws, and write a report confirming its inferiority to justify their existing fighter doctrine. It is a political task disguised as a technical one. But as he looks at this machine, a deeper, more dangerous question begins to form in his analytical mind. What if the truth is not a matter of spirit, but of physics? What if they have been worshipping the wrong god? If you believe that true courage is about facing a difficult reality, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The first few days are a silent, methodical courtship between man and machine. Kenji Tanaka circles the Spitfire as a predator might circle a strange new prey, his mind cataloguing every detail with a cold engineering precision. He ignores the casual mockery of the other pilots, their confident assertions that this British machine is a clumsy brute, lacking the soul of their Zeros. Instead, he focuses on the language the aircraft speaks. He traces the flawless line of the elliptical wing, a shape born not from tradition, but from the unforgiving mathematics of high-speed airflow. He notes the tight fit of the cowling around the massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a masterpiece of contained power. In the cockpit, the scent is alien, a mixture of leather, oil, and something else, something foreign. The instruments are laid out with a different philosophy, a different logic. This is not just an enemy aircraft. It is a complete, coherent thought from another world, and its silence on the tarmac feels less like captivity and more like quiet judgment. His orders, delivered by the stern and politically astute Colonel Ishikawa, are deceptively simple: conduct a full performance evaluation. But the unspoken directive hangs heavy in the humid air of the briefing tent. The purpose of this evaluation is not discovery, but confirmation. He is to find the flaws, to quantify the weaknesses, to write a report that reinforces the central myth of Japanese air superiority. The High Command needs proof that spirit, not horsepower, is the decisive factor in the sky. It is a ritual of self-assurance, a technical exercise designed to soothe anxieties that are beginning to fester at the edges of the empire. Kenji nods, his face an impassive mask, but inside his intellectual honesty bristles. He is being asked to find a predetermined answer, to treat the laws of physics as if they were subject to military decree. He feels the weight of his duty to the Emperor, but also the pull of a colder, more absolute master, the truth. The day of the first flight arrives with a heavy, grey dawn. As Kenji settles into the Spitfire's cockpit, the world outside seems to narrow, framed by the armored glass of the canopy. His ground crew, trained on Japanese machines, moves with a hesitant reverence around the foreign aircraft. The familiar pre-flight ritual becomes a process of discovery. The throttle quadrant feels different under his gloved hand. The stick has a heavier, more solid feel. When he finally engages the starter, the sound that erupts is not the familiar sharp crackle of a Nakajima Sakai engine. It is a deep, resonant growl that builds into a liquid, smooth roar. The sound of 12 cylinders firing in perfect, controlled violence. It is the sound of overwhelming power, a promise and a threat. As he taxis onto the runway, he sees the slender forms of the Zeros parked in their revetments. For the first time, they look not like elegant dancers, but like delicate, fragile birds. He pushes the throttle forward, and the world dissolves into a blur of motion and a symphony of mechanical fury. The Spitfire does not lumber down the runway. It lunges forward, pinning him against the back of his seat with a force that steals his breath. The tail lifts almost instantly, and with a gentle pull on the stick, the earth simply falls away. But it is the moment he retracts the landing gear and points the nose to the sky that changes everything. This is not a climb. It is an eruption. The altimeter needle doesn't creep upwards. It spins like the second hand of a watch on fast forward. The oppressive jungle canopy shrinks into a textured green carpet in seconds. The G-force is a physical presence, a giant hand pressing him into the machine, merging him with its terrifying ascent. He is no longer flying an aircraft. He is riding a shell fired at the heavens, and the ground is a memory he is leaving behind at a rate of 11,000 feet per minute. At 10,000 feet, he levels off, throttling back the Merlin engine to a steady hum. In the sudden relative quiet suspended in the thin, cool air, the revelation arrives. It is not a thought, but a physical sensation, a chilling clarity that floods every nerve. The myth is broken. The sacred belief in the Zeros' unmatched agility, the foundation of their entire fighter doctrine, is a lie. It is a beautiful, honorable lie, but a lie nonetheless. Down below in that green hell, his comrades are fighting and dying based on that lie. They are being told their spirit makes them invincible, while the enemy is building machines like this one, machines that obey a higher, more ruthless authority. He looks at his hands on the controls, realizing he is holding a power that his own nation does not possess. In that moment of profound isolation, high above a war he thought he understood, Kenji Tanaka feels the crushing weight of a forbidden truth. The descent back to the airfield is a slow, mournful spiral. The Spitfire responds to his inputs with a grace that feels almost mocking, its power held. In reserve, its secrets now known. As the wheels touch the tarmac with a gentle chirp, the landing is not an end, but a beginning. He has completed the mission, but he has failed the assignment. He cannot unfeel that climb. He cannot unknow what this machine is capable of. As he taxis past the line of zeros, their red Hinomaru symbols glaring in the harsh sunlight, they no longer represent the pinnacle of Japanese engineering. They look like relics. He has been tasked with dissecting a trophy of war, but instead, the trophy has dissected him, stripping away his certainty and leaving him with a terrible choice. To report the truth would be an act of betrayal against the system he serves. To report the lie would be a betrayal of every pilot he is sworn to protect. The engine sputters to a stop, but in the ringing silence, a new war has just begun inside him. The hangar transforms from a place of maintenance into a silent laboratory of forbidden knowledge. Under the harsh glare of bare light bulbs that hiss in the humid night, Kenji and his chief engineer, a young, sharp-eyed man named Ito, unroll the Spitfire's technical drawings across a makeshift table. The blueprints feel alien to the touch, their crisp lines and English annotations a form of alien scripture. Ito, ever the pragmatist, traces the elegant curve of the supercharger's intake with a calloused finger, his cynicism a shield against the implications of what they are seeing. He sees only metal ratios and tolerances. But Kenji sees something more. He sees a philosophy of power, a brutal efficiency that prioritizes performance over all else. Every night, they dissect the captured beast on paper, their whispered conversations about fluid dynamics and metallurgy, a stark contrast to the patriotic slogans that echo through the base during the day. To move from theory to practice, Kenji arranges a series of mock dogfights. He pits their most gifted Zero pilot, a young prodigy named Sato, against the Spitfire, which he flies himself. From the ground, it is a strange and unsettling ballet. Sato's Zero moves with the exquisite horizontal grace they all revere, carving impossibly tight turns that seem to defy physics. Yet, Kenji does not engage in this dance. He simply executes a single brutal maneuver, a vertical climb. The Spitfire surges upward as if pulled by an invisible wire, shrinking to a dot in the sky in mere seconds. From this untouchable perch, he can choose the moment of engagement, diving down with an advantage of speed and altitude that makes Sato's skill utterly irrelevant. After each hopeless encounter, Sato lands his Zero with a new and unfamiliar silence, the confident fire in his eyes replaced by a shadow of confusion and doubt. The dawn flights become Kenji's private ritual, a solitary communion with the machine. He takes off in the pre-dawn gloom, climbing into the cool, thin air where the jungle's oppression cannot reach. Up there, with the rising sun painting the horizon in strokes of gold and crimson, he pushes the Spitfire to the very edge of its capabilities. He is not just flying, he is listening. He listens to the changing pitch of the Merlin engine as it bites into the thin atmosphere, feels the subtle vibration of the airframe under extreme G-loads, and watches the world tilt and spin through the curved canopy. Each flight is an interrogation, a series of questions posed not in words but in stick and rudder inputs, and the aircraft answers every time with the same irrefutable statement of power. He is not testing a weapon. He is learning the grammar of a new, more powerful language of aerial combat. Back on the ground, the second phase of his investigation begins. He requests the combat loss reports from the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns, sectors where Japanese pilots have been facing heavy resistance. The flimsy sheets of paper, filled with the clipped formal language of military bureaucracy, feel as heavy as tombstones in his hands. He and Ito begin the painstaking process of cross-referencing the data. They plot the reported altitudes of engagements, the types of enemy aircraft encountered, and the circumstances of each loss. Slowly, a horrifying pattern begins to emerge from the columns of dry statistics. The numbers on the Spitfire's performance charts, its climb rate, its service ceiling, its speed at high altitude, are not just abstract figures. They are the exact parameters that align with the unexplained deaths of his comrades half a continent away. The phrases in the report start to haunt him, repeating in his mind like a ghostly chorus. Bounced from above. Enemy appeared out of the sun. No warning before the attack. These were the last words transmitted by men who believed their agility made them masters of the sky. They were fighting a horizontal battle, confident in their ability to outturn any opponent. While the enemy was waging a vertical war, they were not equipped to even comprehend. Kenji realizes that the High Command's faith in the Zero's supremacy was creating a fatal blind spot, a tactical doctrine that was leading its finest pilots into a perfectly engineered trap. The cold, hard numbers on his desk were giving a voice to the ghosts, and they were all telling him the same chilling story of a war that had already changed, even if his superiors refused to see it. One evening, as they work late, Ito finally breaks the tense silence. He taps a fuel consumption chart for the Merlin engine, then points to a corresponding chart for their own Sakai engine. "It's not just the power, Lieutenant," he says, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "It is the efficiency. They are burning a different kind of fire. We believe a pilot's spirit can make up for 100 horsepower, but we are facing an enemy who has found a way to add 500 horsepower instead. They are not fighting with spirit. They are fighting with physics." Ito's words hang in the thick air, a simple, devastating summary of their discovery. It is not a matter of courage or honor. It is a problem of engineering, a brutal equation where one side has solved for a variable that the other did not even know existed. As the investigation concludes, Kenji stands on the tarmac at dusk, watching. The ground crew cover both the Spitfire and a nearby Zero for the night. The two aircraft, silhouetted against the dying tropical sun, seem to represent two different worlds. The Zero is an extension of its pilot, a creature of instinct and grace, a testament to the belief that human will can conquer mechanical limitations. The Spitfire is something else entirely. It is a cold, calculated instrument of industrial might, a machine built not to dance, but to kill with overwhelming force. It is the product of a different way of thinking, a different understanding of war. He has found the truth he was sent to uncover, but it is a truth that feels like a poison. The question was no longer what the enemy's secret was, but what the cost of revealing it would be to his own world. The report was a blank page on a simple wooden desk, yet it felt like the heaviest object in the world. In Kenji's small, humid office, a single bare bulb cast a harsh yellow light, attracting a frantic halo of night insects. The air was a stagnant soup of heat and the metallic scent of oil, but his mind was in the cold, clear emptiness of 30,000 feet. On one side of the desk lay the Spitfire's performance charts, a collection of elegant curves and unforgiving numbers that described a new god of the sky. On the other lay the combat reports, flimsy sheets filled with the final, desperate words of his comrades. The blank page sat between them, a battlefield where two incompatible worlds were about to collide. He was being asked not to document a machine, but to choose a reality, and the stillness of the room felt like the silence before an execution. His duty, as it had been taught to him since childhood, was a simple monolithic concept: absolute loyalty to the emperor and the nation. It was the foundation of his identity, the spiritual armor he wore into battle. But now that armor felt thin and brittle. He saw the face of Colonel Ishikawa, stern and certain, a man for whom the truth was a tool to be shaped for the greater good of morale. Then he saw the faces of the young pilots in his squadron, their eyes bright with a faith he now knew was misplaced. They trusted him. They believed in the myth he was now being ordered to uphold. A new, more terrifying definition of honor began to form in his mind, not the honor of obedience, but the honor of a shepherd who must warn his flock of a wolf they cannot see, even if they call him a traitor for doing so. With a heavy sigh, he picked up his fountain pen. The nib scratched against the paper as he began to write the expected words, the official lie. He wrote of the Spitfire's sluggishness in low-altitude maneuvers and the superior turning radius of the Zero. He praised the unmatched spirit and intuition of the Japanese pilot, framing it as the decisive factor that negated any minor material advantages of the enemy. but each character he formed felt like a betrayal. The ink seemed to bleed on the page, the words themselves looking foreign and false under the dim light. This was not a report. It was a eulogy for men who were not yet dead. He was building a beautiful cage of words for them, decorated with honor and patriotism, but a cage nonetheless. The pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand, an instrument of deception he could barely bring himself to wield. He was saved from the task by a sharp rap on the door. A young adjutant stood silhouetted in the doorway, his posture ramrod straight. "Lieutenant Tanaka," the soldier said, his voice formal. "Colonel Ishikawa requests your presence in his office." Immediately, the summons was not a surprise, but it landed with the finality of a judge's gavel. The time for solitary deliberation was over. As Kenji walked across the dark airfield toward the command post, the familiar sounds of the base seemed to mock him. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal, the distant laughter from the barracks. It was the sound of a world operating on a set of assumptions he knew to be false. The humid night air, usually a familiar blanket, felt suffocating. And the path to the colonel's office seemed like the longest walk of his life, a final journey from the world of physics into the world of politics. Colonel Ishikawa's office was an island of rigid order in the chaos of the jungle. Polished mahogany, gleaming brass, and neatly pinned maps created an atmosphere of unshakable control. The colonel did not rise, but gestured for Kenji to sit, his eyes unblinking. He spoke not of climb rates or superchargers, but of the war effort on the home front, of dwindling resources, and of the critical importance of morale. "A pilot's belief in his machine is as vital as the fuel in its tank, Lieutenant," Ishikawa said, his voice a low, measured instrument of command. "Your report will be read by men in Tokyo, who make decisions that affect the entire empire. It must reinforce the spirit that has always been our greatest strength. It was not an order to lie. It was a carefully worded invitation to become a co-conspirator in a necessary and honorable fiction, a quiet threat wrapped in the language of patriotic duty." Returning to his office, the colonel's words hung in the air like smoke. Reinforce the spirit. It was a command to ignore the numbers, to dismiss the laws of aerodynamics as a foreign inconvenience. He stood before his desk and looked down at the half-written forgery. The elegant, dishonest phrases stared back at him, a monument to his own cowardice. He saw the ghost of Sato, the young pilot, his face etched with confusion after being effortlessly defeated in the mock dogfights. He felt the phantom G-force of the Spitfire's climb, a physical truth that could not be erased by political necessity. In that moment, the conflict within him resolved into a single cold point of clarity. With a slow, deliberate motion, he took the sheet of paper, crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist, and tossed it into the wastebasket. The sound it made was small, but in the silence of the room, it was a declaration of war. He took a fresh sheet of paper. This time, when he put pen to paper, his hand did not hesitate. The words flowed with a stark, brutal precision. He was no longer a poet of patriotism, but a chronicler of a mechanical truth. He wrote of the Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger, not as a feature, but as a verdict. He detailed the Spitfire's performance at high altitude, not as an advantage, but as a separate dimension of combat his men could not enter. He described the 11,000 foot per minute climb rate, not as a statistic, but as the physical manifestation of an industrial and engineering philosophy that was utterly alien to their own. He was not writing a report on an enemy aircraft anymore. He was writing an obituary for an entire way of fighting, a final, honest warning from a man who had flown into the future and had come back to find himself utterly, terrifyingly alone. The secret did not reside in the cockpit, nor in the hands of the pilot. The discovery began deep within the machine's anatomy, in the cold, intricate labyrinth of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Kenji and Ito, working under the dim, buzzing lights of the hangar, came to see it not as a collection of parts, but as a living, breathing creature with a philosophy all its own. Its heart was the two-stage, two-speed supercharger, a device of such ingenious brutality that it felt less like engineering and more like a dark art. This was not merely an engine designed to turn a propeller, it was a system designed to conquer altitude, to create its own atmosphere where none existed. It was a declaration that the sky was not a uniform battlefield, but a stratified territory, with a throne at its peak, and this engine was built specifically to claim it. The raw power was astonishing, but the true revelation was in how that power was sustained in the thin, cold air where their own machines began to starve and die. A supercharger. Kenji explained to his team using stock diagrams chalked onto a metal sheet, is essentially a lung. It forces air into the engine's cylinders, allowing it to burn more fuel and generate more power. But the Merlin's device was a different species of organ altogether. It possessed two sets of lungs. At lower altitudes, it breathed through the first, providing formidable power. But as the aircraft climbed past a critical threshold into the oxygen-starved heights, an automatic gear change engaged the second, more aggressive stage. It was like a deep-sea diver taking a new, more powerful breath just as the pressure became unbearable. This secondary system spun faster, compressing the thin air with ferocious efficiency, feeding the engine a rich diet that allowed it to maintain its sea-level power deep into the stratosphere. In contrast, the Zero's Sakai engine, brilliant in its own right, had only a single-stage supercharger. It was an engine that gasped for breath just when the Spitfire was inhaling deepest, a fatal disparity written in the language of atmospheric physics. This vertical power would have been useless, however, without a form designed to master it. The soul of the Spitfire, Kenji realized, was its iconic elliptical wing. Where the Zero's wings were straight and angular, designed for the sublime agility of a horizontal turnfight, the Spitfire's wings were a seamless, organic curve. This shape was no aesthetic choice. It was a mathematical solution to a deadly problem. The ellipse distributed aerodynamic lift more evenly across its span, reducing the violent drag that plagued other wing designs at high speeds. This meant that when Kenji dove from 30,000 feet, the Spitfire remained unnervingly stable, a steady gun platform even at the edge of its performance envelope. The engine provided the power to climb into the sun, but it was the wing that gave it the grace and stability to kill from it. The two components worked in a perfect lethal harmony, a union of brute force and aerodynamic elegance that felt utterly, hopelessly unbeatable. The mock dogfights became less like training exercises and more like grim, ritualistic proofs of this new terrifying theorem. Sato, their finest pilot, would take to the sky in his Zero, his spirit a burning flame of confidence. He would perform a perfect horizontal pirouette, a maneuver of such grace it seemed to bend the laws of physics, daring Kenji to engage him in his own arena. But Kenji would simply refuse the invitation. He would pull back on the stick, and the Spitfire would answer not with a turn but with an ascension. The world would fall away as he clawed for the sky, leaving Sato's elegant dance far below, a beautiful but irrelevant gesture. From his perch 2 miles above, Kenji could watch Sato circle, a predator observing a prey that did not even know it was being hunted. The battle was a foregone conclusion, decided by a dimension of combat Sato could not access. It was a contest between a swordsman and a sniper, and skill with a blade was no defense against a bullet, fired from a place of perfect safety. The true horror was revealed not in the sky above Burma, but on the flimsy pages of combat reports from distant, blood-soaked islands. In the quiet of the night, illuminated by a single lantern, Kenji and Ito plotted the coordinates of their fallen comrades on a large map. They were no longer just names. They were data points in a chilling arithmetic of death. The phrases from the reports began to form a ghostly chorus. Attacked from the sun. Never saw him. He came out of nowhere, straight down. These were not tales of heroic duels. They were accounts of executions. Kenji laid the Spitfire's performance chart over the map, and the pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The altitudes from which the attacks came perfectly matched the Merlin engine's optimal performance band. The incredible rate of climb explained how the enemy could position themselves so high above, unseen, waiting. Their pilots were not being outfought. They were being scientifically removed from the sky. This discovery went beyond a single machine. It was an indictment of an entire philosophy of war. The Imperial Japanese Air Force had built its doctrine around the code of Bushido, translating the honor and artistry of a samurai duel to the theater of the sky. The Zero was its katana, a light, exquisitely sharp weapon designed for a close, honorable fight where skill and spirit would prevail. They had perfected the art of the horizontal turn, believing it to be the ultimate expression of a pilot's soul. But the enemy had refused to engage in that duel. They had built a different weapon for a different war. They had built a rifle. They were waging a vertical war, a cold industrial war of energy and altitude, a war of physics. It was a strategy that was a cold logical exploitation of their own doctrine's most cherished belief. Their greatest strength, their faith in the horizontal dogfight, had become their most predictable and fatal vulnerability. One humid evening, standing between the two silent aircraft in the hangar, the final, simple truth settled upon Kenji with the weight of a shroud. The Zero, with its delicate frame and faded Hinomaru, looked like a relic of a more romantic age, an artifact of faith. The Spitfire, solid and menacing, seemed like a thing from the future, an instrument of cold, hard reason. Ito, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, broke the silence, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We have been trying to make up for a lack of horsepower with an abundance of spirit," he said, not looking at Kenji. "But they have not bothered with spirit. They have simply added more horsepower." In that moment, all the complex charts, the ghostly reports, and the terrifying climbs condensed into that single, devastating sentence. The war they were fighting was not the one they had trained for. They were offering prayers in a battle that required equations, and the sky did not care about the honor of the men it was about to reclaim. The briefing room was a void, insulated from the jungle's humid chaos by polished wood and the stern, unblinking portraits of ancestors. The air, cooled by a single laboring fan, was thick with the scent of discipline and unspoken expectation. Kenji stood before Colonel Ishikawa and the assembled officers, a line of stone-faced men who were the architects of their world. In his hands he held the final report, its pages feeling as thin as a prayer and as heavy as a coffin lid. The silence in the room was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a physical pressure exerted by centuries of tradition. Every eye was on him, waiting for the familiar, comforting words of confirmation, for the ritualistic reaffirmation of their own invincibility. He was not just a pilot. In that moment, he was the custodian of a sacred myth, and they were its high priests. He began to speak, his voice quiet but clear, echoing slightly in the austere space. He did not start with climb rates or supercharger ratios. He began with a tribute, an ode to the soul of the Japanese warrior. He spoke of the Zero as an extension of the pilot spirit, a blade of wind in the hands of a sky-sworn samurai. He praised the courage of men who flew into battle, armed with a faith more powerful than any armor, whose intuition in a turning dogfight was a form of artistry the enemy could never comprehend. His words were a balm, a carefully constructed piece of theater designed to soothe the anxieties that flickered behind their stoic masks. For a moment, he gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. A faint, almost imperceptible nod from Colonel Ishikawa signaled that the ritual was proceeding as it should, that the proper respects were being paid to the gods of war. Then his voice shifted. The poetic cadence fell away, replaced by the stark, level tone of a man delivering a verdict. He paused, his gaze lifting from the floor to meet Colonel Ishikawa's directly. "But there is another truth," he said, the words cutting through the comfortable atmosphere. He began to describe not the machine but the sensation. He spoke of the brutal physical shove against his spine, the world dissolving into a vertical blur, the altimeter needle not climbing, but spinning like a child's toy. He did not describe an aircraft's performance. He described a force of nature, an ascension so violent and absolute that it felt like a judgment from the heavens. He was translating the cold language of physics into the universal grammar of human experience, forcing them to feel the G-force, to see the ground fall away, to understand that what he had experienced was not a tactic but a law. With a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to command the attention of the entire room, Kenji placed the officially prepared report on the corner of the briefing table. He did not dismiss it. He simply abandoned it. From the breast pocket of his uniform, he withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded into a neat square. It was covered in his own dense, precise handwriting. The rustle of the unfolding paper was the only sound, a small act of defiance that was louder than a gunshot. "The enemy has built a machine that does not engage us in a duel," he continued, his eyes scanning the notes. "It does not respect our arena. It creates a new one miles above our heads where our skill is irrelevant. This is not a failure of our spirit. It is a failure of our understanding of the sky itself. He was no longer a subordinate offering data. He was a witness testifying to a new and terrible reality. He took a breath, the final moment of silence before the heresy. "Our spirit is our greatest weapon," he stated, his voice ringing with a strange and mournful conviction. "But spirit cannot alter the laws of aerodynamics. To deny this machine's advantage is to send our pilots to an honorable, but needless death." He looked at each man in turn, his gaze holding theirs, forcing them to see the ghosts of the men whose final reports he had read. "True honor," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper yet filling the room, "demands we see the enemy for what he is, not what we wish him to be." The words were not an accusation, but an appeal, a final, desperate attempt to trade a beautiful lie for a brutal, life-saving truth. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering against the unyielding wall of fact. A profound, stunned silence descended upon the room. It was heavier than before, no longer the silence of expectation but of impact. The air seemed to crackle with the unspoken, with the collision of deeply held faith and an undeniable, unwelcome revelation. The faces of the officers, once impenetrable masks of authority, were now a gallery of shock, anger, and a flicker of something deeper, a dawning, horrifying comprehension. Colonel Ishikawa did not move, his expression a frozen sculpture of fury at the insubordination and a terrifying, unwilling respect for the courage it had taken. In that silent, wood-paneled room, surrounded by the symbols of an empire, Kenji Tanaka stood utterly alone, a solitary prophet who had chosen the cold, lonely clarity of the truth over the warm, comforting embrace of the faith. The history of what happened next is not written in the official records of the war. It is written in the silence that followed Kenji Tanaka's words, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all the heat and sound from the jungle outside. Colonel Ishikawa's face remained a mask of granite, but a subtle tremor in his hand as he reached for a cup of tea betrayed the seismic shock of the revelation. Kenji was dismissed not with anger, but with a chilling, clinical detachment. He walked out of the briefing room and back into the humid night, a man who had fulfilled his duty to the truth, and in doing so had become an exile in his own world. He had not presented a technical analysis. He had delivered a eulogy for a faith, and the institution he served would never forgive him for exposing the mortality of its gods. The truth had been spoken, but like a seed planted in stone, it was given no soil in which to grow. Kenji's report, the product of so much solitary flight and meticulous study, was never sent to Tokyo. It was classified as inconclusive and buried in a steel filing cabinet, a dangerous piece of heresy locked away from the eyes of those who needed to see it most. The war machine, a colossal entity fueled by momentum and mythology, was too large and too proud to alter its course. The official narrative remained unchanged. Directives continued to praise the sublime agility of the Zero, and young pilots were still told that their Yamato Damashi, their Japanese spirit, was an invisible armor that no enemy shell could pierce. The Spitfire was eventually disassembled, its parts crated up and forgotten, its powerful voice silenced. The system chose the comfort of a familiar lie over the terrifying and disruptive power of an inconvenient fact, a decision made not in briefing rooms, but in the very soul of a nation at war. And so the ghosts continued to gather. The combat reports from the Solomon Islands, from New Guinea, from every desperate frontier of the shrinking empire, kept telling the same tragic story. The names of the fallen pilots became a grim, repeating chorus, each one a testament to the truth Kenji had tried to reveal. They were brave men, honorable men, sent into a vertical battlefield with a horizontal weapon, their artistry and courage rendered irrelevant by an enemy who fought with a different set of rules. The price for institutional hubris was paid not by the colonels in their polished offices, but by the young men in their cockpits, who met their fate in a flash of cannon fire from a sun they were never taught to guard. Kenji's unspoken warning became a prophecy, fulfilled again and again in the vast indifferent emptiness of the Pacific sky. Kenji Tanaka himself was not punished, not in any official sense. A public reprimand would have given his findings a dangerous legitimacy. Instead, he was promoted and reassigned, a form of honorable exile. He was sent to a remote training base far from the front lines, tasked with molding the next generation of pilots. He spent the remainder of the war teaching cadets the elegant, deadly dance of the zero, his heart a hollow chamber of unspoken knowledge. He taught them with a quiet, mournful precision, knowing he was preparing them for a war that had already moved on, arming them with a beautiful sword for a battle that would be decided by the sniper's rifle. His true punishment was not demotion, but the daily burden of watching brave young men embrace a faith he knew to be fatal. In the end, the story of the captured Spitfire is not about the superiority of one machine over another. It is about the brutal neutrality of the truth itself. That aircraft, resting on a forgotten Burmese airstrip, was a physical testament to a law higher than any military doctrine or national creed, the law of physics. It did not care about honor, it did not respond to spirit, and it was unimpressed by tradition. It simply was. Kenji Tanaka's journey was a collision with this unforgiving reality, a discovery that the most dangerous enemy is not the one you face in the sky, but the one you refuse to see in the mirror. Hubris, he learned, is the most fatal of all design flaws, and it can ground an entire empire more surely than any weapon. Years later, the jungle would reclaim the airfield, its relentless green vines swallowing the cracked tarmac and the rusted skeletons of forgotten machines. But the sky does not forget. It remembers the courage of the pilots and the cold, hard logic that governed their fate. So it stands as a silent witness to the fact that the most profound act of loyalty is not blind obedience, but the agonizing courage to confront a devastating truth for the sake of others. If you believe that true honor is measured by the willingness to face reality, no matter the cost, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. For some truths are carried not on the wings of victory, but in the quiet dignity of a warning that was never heeded.